All the way back in 2018, the Netflix Avatar: The Last Airbender adaptation was announced. And like many other diehard fans of the franchise, I couldn't help but roll my eyes. However, with this announcement came the confirmation that the original creators of the series will be returning to help direct it. And after the abomination that was M. Night Shyamalan's 2010 The Last Airbender movie, there are many people that thought there was no way it could possibly be worse. But the road from being announced to being released was far from smooth, with the most notable hiccup being in 2020 when the original creators announced they were leaving the project due to creative differences with Netflix. This news really upset me, and the majority of fans, and I'd all but decided that no matter the outcome, I wasn't even going to bother investing myself in the series. Then, the pandemic, the writer's strike, and nearly 4 years passed without any news or updates about the series at all, when Netflix suddenly started releasing small tidbits of information such as casting announcements and concept art. While the majority of this information I mostly brushed aside, from what I saw of the casting, it looked like they were doing a pretty good job of selecting actors who fit the descriptions of the characters. Then, as cast interviews began to release and the first initial trailers came out, I found myself torn between getting invested and ignoring it altogether. A lot of what I was seeing looked like the makings of a faithful adaptation, but many of the articles that Netflix was releasing said otherwise. Avatar: The Last Airbender is without a doubt my favorite animated TV series of all time, and I can distinctly remember watching the finale on a hot summer's night in my parents' attic back in 2008. Since then, I have watched the series over and over again so many times that I've lost count, so I really doubt that I could have just let this adaptation pass by without at least trying to watch it. And as I mentioned, when they began to release images of faithful recreations of characters, costumes, and locations, I did begin to have at least a little bit of hope that this series might prove to be good. So now that it's been almost a month since its release, and I've had time to sit and think about it, I wanted to dive into the ongoing debate surrounding the series, and give my 2 cents on the matter. As always, I love to keep the conversation going after the video, so feel free to leave your opinions in the comments down below. But without further ado, here's my take on the good, the bad, and whether or not this show should have even been made in the first place. For my review, I'm going to try to the best of my ability to treat Netflix's adaptation as its own work and not judge it as a one-to-one comparison. When I went in watching it, I tried to go in with the mentality that I would judge it on its own merits, as its own series. Obviously, it was never going to be as good as the original, but I think pretty much everybody knew that going in. It's just one of those things like The Lord of the Rings or Star Wars, where no adaptation is going to be able to beat the original. I'm still flabbergasted they're making a new Harry Potter series barely over a decade since the last movie came out, but that's another topic entirely, not to get too sidetracked. Now, in terms of structure, the Netflix series is split into 8 episodes, whereas the original series was stretched into 20. And even though the total runtime for the live action is technically longer than the cartoon was, there are many elements from the first season missing. Now, as I said, I don't want my review to be a one-to-one comparison, but first I think there is something very important to bring up. Many people are upset that they didn't get around to covering everything from the animated series even with this extra hour of runtime. And I don't think that's a fair argument at all. With the way they structured the first season into these 8 episodes, there simply isn't enough time to fit all the events within cohesive story arcs. Due to these constraints, many storylines are interconnected with each other, such as Omashu, Jet, the Northern Air Temple, and the Cave of Two Lovers, all taking place within the same arc. I personally really liked how they did this, and while it did cause some elements to feel clunky, I feel like it was a really smart way of moving pieces around so that we still got to experience iconic characters and storylines. This is where the strength of an adaptation lies, in its ability to trim off excess material and rearrange parts into a new format. And yes, as I said, it does make some parts feel clunky, but I ultimately think this was a very smart and necessary change made by Netflix. But in terms of the core of the story, for the way Netflix is going about it, I think they did a good job. Yes, it follows a slightly different arc than the cartoon, whereas the original series starts off more about Aang focusing on becoming the Avatar and mastering all 4 elements. This series seems to have the war with the Fire Nation as a much more prominent and looming threat. Now, don't get me wrong, it was a major part in the animated series too, but the core of the live action is very clearly centered around the devastation that has happened in these last 100 years. And to that, I think they did an excellent job. The stakes definitely feel far more severe in this version, for better or for worse. But as a standalone story, it does a good job of holding to its main thesis. Personally, I think the true test of an adaptation is whether an audience previously unexposed to the source material is able to connect with and understand the show based off of only what they're given in the series. And in this case, I would count Netflix's Avatar a success. I think it did a good job with characterizing the world and giving the audience an understanding of the lore. One thing I don't like about this series, however, and this extends to a lot of shows coming out nowadays, is the need to treat the audience like we are completely incapable of understanding subtext. Almost every scene in this series has to involve a character outright explaining in detail how they're feeling, or giving an in-depth analysis about how the world works, rather than letting the audience simply figure out that information for themselves by watching the way the world moves around and interacts with the characters. The storytelling model of show, don't tell really does seem to be a dying art, and it bothers me. But I don't know, I've personally witnessed firsthand many people incapable of understanding hidden meaning, or being unwilling to wait until the next episode for an answer to something that didn't make sense. So maybe this is just going to be the model for shows geared towards general audiences nowadays. Who knows? Another issue is that this show is trying to be for mature audiences. But like I just mentioned, spoon feeds us information as if we're all children. In my very first video for this channel, I talked about how every studio is currently looking to make the next Game of Thrones. And not 2 weeks later, Netflix released an article stating that this series is designed to draw in the same type of audience that Game of Thrones did. I almost couldn't believe it when I read that, and I immediately despaired. The idea that every show needs to be dark, gritty, and for adults just drives me crazy. And even at that, studios continue to fail why Game of Thrones was a success. I swear that every time an executive sends someone out to do research on why Game of Thrones is successful, they just watch a highlight reel of all the battles from the show and go, oh, that must be why it's a hit. But they forget that at its strongest, Game of Thrones was just about a handful of people in a throne room talking about the concept of power. And it wasn't afraid to leave questions for the audience. It was a mature show, and it treated the audience like they were mature as well, trusting them to think about what things meant for themselves. In the interest of wanting to end the video on a positive note, I'm going to go ahead and get everything I didn't like about the show out of the way. As I mentioned before, I am a die-hard Avatar fan, and I have been watching the show since it first came out when I was only 5 years old. With that being said, I'm surprised to note that my opinions don't seem to reflect with what the majority of the internet is saying. I watched the new series all in one day when it first came out, and I was absolutely blown away by how many people on the internet just absolutely hated it, and even had the gall to say things like, the 2010 movie was better because at least it only made us suffer for 2 hours. And I don't know, I just find that to be incredibly ridiculous. Yes, I agree there are things they did wrong, but all in all, I found myself enjoying it. And I think that's mostly due to the fact that I was able to view this adaptation as its own thing, and not something trying to parade around as a substitute for the original. The month leading up to the show, I found myself pretty excited for its release, and then immediately got worried the more that Netflix continued to release all these articles claiming that every character had been totally altered from what they were in the show. This is when I started hearing a lot of people saying that they had just given up and weren't even going to watch it. But I held out and decided to watch it for myself. And this is what I found. Ultimately, I think many of the changes to the characters I was really worried about ended up being mostly pretty minor, especially with people like Sokka, who I was most concerned about going in. Even though he and Aang aren't given nearly enough opportunities to goof off and joke around, I think they did a pretty good job with what they were given, which leads into my next point. What they were given was mostly pretty terrible. The script for this show is all over the place, and for the majority of the first season, it's really weak. The direction the actors were given as well also seems really peculiar. There are a lot of line deliveries that feel incredibly unnatural, and unfortunately, most of them are found within the first episode. Sokka has a couple of one-liners that just fell completely flat for me.
Let's time we show those flameheads they can't just step all over us.
But the biggest offender by far is when the actress playing Gran recites the opening monologue from the cartoon. This could have been a great way to give exposition and serve as a fun callback to the fans. But I've never seen a line delivery feel so recited. They might as well have been reading off a teleprompter for some of these scenes. The thing that pains me the most about this, however, is the fact that since it's all within the first episode, and not to mention so early on into it, that I feel like so many people are going to get to that point and just say, well, I've seen everything I need to. And I just find that so unfair because I think the show does genuinely get better as it goes along, at least in my opinion. The way I think you should approach watching this show should be the same way you approach something like Scott Pilgrim Takes Off, which is not a one-to-one adaptation, but rather a different exploration of the story altogether. My other big problem involves the pacing. The moments they decide to zoom through and the ones they decide to linger on seem really random to me. I would have loved for more slower moments with the main cast where we actually get to see them bond and interact. And it's crazy that this is even real, but why didn't Aang learn a single thing about waterbending in the entire first season? I understand that they ended at the North Pole, and there's probably going to be a time skip where he'll learn it in between seasons, but it would have been nice to see him at least start his training. And in terms of the characters, like I said, I don't want to compare them to the cartoon because I want to view this as its own adaptation. But I just want to state that I was very upset with the way they handled Boomy. I understand they wanted to focus a lot more on the consequences of Aang having left this world for 100 years of war, but first off, in this adaptation, Aang didn't deliberately flee his responsibility and get trapped in the iceberg. Instead, they frame it more as an accident, which completely erases all the interesting character growth where Aang has to learn to get over his guilt. But in this show, they simply tell him he should feel bad when he really doesn't have a big reason to. Ultimately, this show just felt very uneven to me. Every time I started to really like something they were doing, they would immediately throw in something that really infuriated me. I'm usually not super picky when it comes to the media I watch, so it wasn't a huge issue for me to power my way through it. But I definitely don't hold it against anyone who decided that this show wasn't for them. I do think so much of the criticism for it online is important, and it's a way of letting the voices of the fans be heard. Obviously, it's important to be nice and constructive with the feedback, but hopefully it leads to some changes in season 2. And speaking of which, the show was recently renewed for both seasons 2 and 3, which is good because if they actually want to have a chance of finishing the entire series, they need to act fast before Gordon Cormier gets too old. But that does mean we are going to be getting more from this series, so feedback is important for letting the creators know how to tailor the show. One of the things I've been very appreciative for about this show is for all of the people hating on it, almost everyone agrees that the casting was done excellently, and that the actors gave great performances despite a stiff script. Right off the bat, I think the actors for Aang and Zuko, Gordon Cormier and Dallas Liu did a great job as the leads. And what impressed me more than anything is they were able to take one of the greatest characters in fiction and I think they did him justice. I really loved the way they handled Zuko, and the Blue Spirit episode was probably my favorite out of the whole series. Also, minor spoilers for the show, but the reveal that Zuko's crew was the same battalion of men that he got himself banished over defending is an absolutely incredible addition. And moving forward, I think I'm just going to consider this canon for the animated show as well. His relationship with Iroh was also really well done, and once again, I found their storyline to be my favorite aspect of the series. Like I said, I really enjoyed Aang as well, and I think they picked the perfect actor to portray him. My only issue is that with everything I see of the actor outside of the show, it just makes me wish they would let him use his actual personality more. In my opinion, he feels more like Aang when it's just Gordon being Gordon than in the actual series itself. Sokka was a good addition as well, and overall I found myself satisfied with the way they adapted the characters I was most nervous about going into it. I like the actors for Katara as well, but I feel like they just didn't give her anything to do this season. I'm really hoping that moving forward they're going to make her a much more important part of the story. Also, to everyone who's upset that they didn't have Aang go through the Cave of Two Lovers with Katara and instead it was Sokka, I just don't think that's a huge deal. And I personally don't mind if they avoid showing any of the romance between Aang and Katara until much later into the series. It doesn't really play a huge part of the story anyway until the last season, so it doesn't really bother me. I also love the way everything looked in this show. I thought the costumes were amazing, for the most part, and everything felt like it was ripped right out of the cartoon. Each location felt so realized, and the CGI was surprisingly really good. The bending in this show was actually one of its strongest elements, if I'm being honest. And the opening sequence of this show did such a good job for getting me on board with the way this series was going to handle fight sequences. I will say the water bending seemed to be one of the weaker points, but everything still looked fantastic. Although sometimes it looked a little too good. There's a pretty distinct CGI gleam that's in just about every scene due to the overutilization of the volume, which is a tool many production companies are now using to simulate digital environments. Most of the time I think it's used pretty well, but there's also a lot of scenes where it's really obvious that characters aren't actually in a real, lived-in world. One of the things I would like to say is that this show makes it very clear that the writers have a tremendous amount of love for the Avatar universe. Whether or not you enjoyed the way they handled the story, you cannot deny that they did their very best to show respect to the source material where they could. There are very few examples when Netflix freestyles with the lore. And even when they do, such as the plotline about Roku stealing an idol from Ko, the idol they use is of the Mother of Faces, which is an obscure spirit found in one of the Avatar graphic novel spin-off stories. So when I saw that, I knew that the Avatar writers knew their lore. and that instantly made me gain respect for them. While I do have some mixed opinions about the first season of Netflix's Avatar adaptation, I can truthfully say that I am excited for the next 2 seasons. In my opinion, season 1 was going to be the hardest to adapt anyway, since it's mostly based off of fun, adventure of the week style episodes. But moving forward, the plot of Avatar gets a lot deeper, and even if they only stick to it as loosely as they did the first season, it'll still be great just due to how strong the bones of the original series are. Also, a quick side note, I really hope they switch to doing 10 episodes per season moving forward, otherwise it's going to be really tough to cram everything in. But bringing us back to the original series, I'd like to talk about whether or not this show should have even been made, and if a live action adaptation was really necessary. My answer to that is, it's complicated. My simple response to the question is always going to fall back to, just watch the original cartoon. It's one of the greatest series ever created and it deserves to be watched in its original form. Even though I enjoyed the live action, I would never in a million years recommend somebody watch it before first watching the cartoon. It is nowhere near close to serving as a substitute. And in a perfect world, they would have never needed to adapt this. But unfortunately, we live in a world where a great number of people turn their nose up at animation, and will only ever watch something if it's in live action. While this does bother me, and it makes me sad that so many people are choosing to limit their experiences in such a way, it is the sad truth of reality that a live action adaptation will almost always earn more money than an animated one. And while I think monetary gain should never be a reason for creating an adaptation, even though it is a film industry, so that's the way that things work. But in the argument of whether or not this show needed to be adapted, I would say yes. Avatar: The Last Airbender is one of the greatest stories ever told, and if there is a large number of people that are unwilling to watch it just because it's animated or for kids, then I don't think I see a huge fault in Netflix deciding to adapt it into a form that everyone can enjoy. Like I said, in a perfect world, everybody would just watch the animated version. And if you've somehow made it to the end of this video and you haven't seen either version, stick with the original, but this new Netflix version does provide fun supplemental content. And I view it as no different than going to see a Broadway adaptation of one of your favorite movies. To wrap things up, there is a lot to say about this series that I didn't get around to, so feel free to leave a comment down below and I will get around to responding and we can hash out everything that was good and everything that was bad about this show. I'm sure there are going to be a lot of people who are going to list many examples as to why this show sucks, or claim that I'm not actually a real fan if I enjoyed it. But at the end of the day, there is nothing Netflix can do to erase the experience of the original cartoon. And in my opinion, this adaptation doesn't diminish the franchise at all. I just see it as a fun expansion, and I really wish more people would be willing to be a little more open-minded about it. I'm hopeful that it will get better as the series goes along, but in the meantime, I'm really just loving how much this series has gotten everybody on the internet talking about how incredible Avatar is again. And even if that was the only thing this series caused to happen, then that alone makes it worth existing in my eyes.